The atmospheric pressure inside the cavernous, sprawling main hall of the Miami Metropolitan Convention Center was meticulously engineered to be kept at a deliberate, almost punishingly freezing temperature, a sharp, unforgiving, and deeply symbolic contrast to the suffocating, heavy coastal humidity that was aggressively pressing against the reinforced glass walls of the exterior facade, ultimately setting a deeply uncomfortable physical stage for what was about to rapidly devolve into the most merciless, surgical political dissection ever captured in the modern era of American broadcast history. The heavily publicized event in question was the highly anticipated America's Economic Summit, an elite, invite-only gathering of international policymakers, ruthless financial titans, and veteran legislative power brokers who had descended upon the city in armadas of blacked-out security SUVs. But despite the presence of global dignitaries, the true, undeniable gravity of the massive room was concentrated entirely on the elevated center stage, where the glowing red tally lights of a dozen high-definition network broadcast cameras burned with an unblinking, predatory intensity. The summit's organizers, operating either through an acute, almost sadistic sense of theatrical tension or a highly calculated, ratings-driven desire for prime-time ideological friction, had deliberately engineered a seating arrangement that explicitly forced Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to sit directly across the circular, highly polished mahogany table from Senator Marco Rubio, intentionally positioning the unapologetic populist firebrand and the deeply entrenched veteran institutionalist in an inescapable face-to-face collision course that offered absolutely no avenues for diplomatic retreat. The National Press Corps, sensing the raw volatility of the matchup, was packed tightly into a designated pen 3 rows deep against the back barricades, their telephoto lenses trained relentlessly on the stage, while the exclusive VIP sections were completely overflowing with delegates, strategists, and lobbyists, who implicitly understood that this was not merely a polite panel discussion regarding fiscal policy, but rather a high-stakes, deeply personal proxy war for the ideological future of the American economy. Yet, existing entirely detached from the polished Italian leather loafers, the bespoke silk ties, and the whispered, cynical calculations of the surrounding political operatives, hidden away in a deliberately shadowed, poorly illuminated corner of the general admission seating, sat a quietly observant middle-aged man wearing a faded, threadbare collared shirt that still carried the faint, indelible, and distinctly honest scent of toasted flour, active yeast, and caramelized sugar. He was the exhausted owner of a small, desperately struggling family bakery nestled deep in the working-class heart of Little Havana, a man whose hands were permanently calloused and heavily scarred from decades of unrelenting, back-breaking physical labor, and who, just that very morning beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of his kitchen, had been forced to look 3 of his most loyal, long-term employees directly in the eye and quietly, tearfully inform them that they no longer had jobs, because the crushing, inescapable weight of compounding inflation and stalled government subsidies had finally devoured his razor-thin profit margins. He had absolutely no business being in a room filled with multi-million-dollar political action committee directors, and he had not driven his battered pickup truck to this sprawling, hyper-secured convention center out of any sense of partisan loyalty or ideological fervor. Rather, he was a man entirely exhausted by the endless, self-serving theater of Washington politics, arriving here solely because he desperately needed to look directly into the faces of the powerful people who casually held the fragile, fraying lifeline of his absolute livelihood in their manicured hands, seeking to fundamentally understand who exactly was playing God with the day-to-day survival of the rapidly collapsing American working class. When the impeccably dressed moderator finally concluded her extensive, carefully sanitized introductory remarks and yielded the floor to the panel, Ocasio-Cortez seized her microphone with the practiced, predatory instinct of a modern politician who had essentially built an entire, formidable digital empire upon the foundation of commanding the absolute, undivided attention of any room she entered, her posture immediately radiating the supreme, untouchable confidence of someone who firmly believed that the moral high ground was her exclusive, permanent residence. She leaned aggressively forward over the mahogany table, allowing the harsh, unforgiving studio lighting to catch the sharp, combative angle of her jawline, and directed a stare of pure, unadulterated, and highly televised contempt straight into the stoic, unreadable face of Marco Rubio, her voice immediately filling the massive hall with a booming, theatrical resonance explicitly designed by her communications team to echo flawlessly across social media algorithms and late-night news broadcasts for weeks to come. I am absolutely not here today to trade empty, hollow pleasantries, nor am I here to dutifully recite the exact same tired, heavily sanitized corporate talking points that this broken institution continually uses to anesthetize the American public into a state of quiet submission. She began, her tone vibrating with a meticulously engineered, righteous fury that she had flawlessly perfected over years of viral, combative committee hearings on Capitol Hill. I look directly across this table at Senator Rubio, and I do not see a dedicated public servant. I see a flawlessly calibrated, incredibly well-funded money-printing machine engineered specifically for the absolute protection of the billionaire class, a politician who has sat comfortably in the upper chamber for decades, fiercely defending the shadowy, archaic banking secrecy laws that allow the ultra-rich to illegally hoard their untaxed wealth in offshore accounts, while the actual, bleeding, working people of this country, the exhausted people who physically build our cities, who clean our hospitals, and who serve our food, are literally collapsing from physical exhaustion just trying to make their basic monthly rent payments. She allowed her sharply articulated words to hang suspended in the chilled, heavily air-conditioned air of the auditorium, expertly utilizing the dramatic silence to let the severe accusation burrow deep into the collective consciousness of the audience, masterfully painting him as the ultimate, unapologetic avatar of unchecked corporate greed while simultaneously positioning herself as the sole, incorruptible, and fiercely loyal vanguard of the disenfranchised, voiceless masses. The future of this desperate nation absolutely does not belong to the dark money contracts, the corporate bailouts, and the backroom, smoke-filled deals that you and your colleagues have spent your entire lucrative careers carefully curating and violently protecting in the shadows, she declared, her voice rising to a masterful, commanding crescendo of absolute political certainty as she motioned broadly, almost regally, toward the banks of flashing cameras. The future fundamentally belongs to radical transparency, to unapologetic, structural accountability, and it belongs completely and exclusively to the working-class families that I proudly stand here to represent. Families who are completely sick and tired of being bled dry by the very establishment you have sworn an oath to protect. A sudden, highly energetic smattering of applause and vocal agreements broke out from a concentrated pocket of progressive delegates and allied activists seated on the far left side of the hall, and Ocasio-Cortez leaned back deeply into her heavy leather executive chair, a triumphant, razor-thin, and deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips, utterly convinced that she had just delivered a fatal, unanswerable rhetorical strike that would effortlessly dominate the evening news cycle and solidify her position as the moral victor of the summit. Directly across the polished expanse of the circular table, Senator Marco Rubio did not physically flinch, did not shift his weight in his seat, and did not betray even a microscopic fraction of the defensive agitation or desperate anger that Ocasio-Cortez had so clearly and deliberately intended to publicly provoke, maintaining instead the chilling, absolute, and terrifyingly calm stillness of a highly seasoned legislative predator who had miraculously survived decades of the most brutal, blood-soaked political trench warfare that Washington had ever conceived. He did not immediately reach for his microphone to furiously defend his honor, nor did he attempt to raise his vocal register to frantically counter her soaring, aggressive volume. Instead, he allowed the fading echo of her partisan applause to patter out and die entirely, letting the heavy, intensely uncomfortable silence stretch for several agonizing seconds until the collective, breathless anticipation in the sprawling room transformed into a thick, almost suffocating atmospheric pressure. With slow, highly deliberate, and heavily scrutinized movements that immediately drew the mechanical focus of every single broadcast camera in the room, Rubio calmly unclasped the twin, heavy brass locks of his weathered, dark leather briefcase, the sharp, metallic click slicing cleanly through the quiet hall like the racking of a slide on a firearm, and reached inside to carefully extract a single, solitary sheet of standard white paper, its upper right corner conspicuously stamped with the rigid, unmistakable black bars of an internal, highly classified congressional security barcode. "Thank you, Representative, for your opening thoughts," Rubio finally began, his voice pitched in an incredibly low, even, and terrifyingly calm baritone that physically required the thousands of people in the audience to lean slightly forward in their seats just to clearly hear him, utilizing the exact tone of a veteran prosecutor who was absolutely not interested in participating in a theatrical performance, but was instead preparing to execute a clinical, inescapable structural demolition of a hostile witness. Your specific brand of public rhetoric is always exceptionally polished, always soaring for the cameras, and always deeply, beautifully emotional, which I know plays incredibly well to your dedicated base of online supporters. But since you have just so passionately and so loudly invoked the sacred fundamental principles of radical transparency, and since you have just publicly sworn your absolute, undying allegiance to the financial survival of the American worker, I think it is only fair and proper that we completely bypass the philosophical poetry for a moment and critically discuss the brutal, documented reality of your own legislative record, specifically focusing on the critical $50 million Small Business Relief Act that entirely dominated our congressional debates just last month. Rubio strategically paused his delivery, his dark, unblinking eyes locking directly onto hers with a sudden, piercing, and unavoidable intensity, as he carefully laid the psychological trap with masterful, practiced precision, asking a question so seemingly benign, so deeply rooted in her own established public narrative that it effortlessly bypassed every single one of her highly trained media defense perimeters. If my memory of the congressional record serves me correctly, Representative, at the height of that intense legislative battle, you took directly to your various social media platforms in tears, broadcasting live to millions of your dedicated followers, promising them unequivocally, looking straight into the lens, that you would do absolutely everything within your considerable legislative power to fiercely fight for the passage of that specific financial legislation and protect the highly vulnerable neighborhood workers it was explicitly designed to save from bankruptcy. Is that an accurate recollection of your public stance? Without even a fraction of a second of internal hesitation, utterly blinded by the sheer, overwhelming momentum of her own perceived moral superiority and eager to reassert her dominance over the narrative, Ocasio-Cortez snatched the rhetorical bait mid-air, thrusting her chin defiantly upward as she spoke sharply and directly into her microphone. Absolutely, I remember that broadcast perfectly, and I will fiercely defend that righteous fight to my absolute last breath, because unlike some people at this table, I will never, ever stop going to the mat for the essential emergency funds that our marginalized local communities so desperately need to survive this manufactured economic crisis. The invisible steel jaws of the legislative trap instantly snapped shut with a deafening, absolute finality that seemed to physically alter the baseline atmospheric pressure inside the massive convention center, as Rubio, without ever breaking his intense, locked eye contact with the Congresswoman, slowly and deliberately slid the single, bar-coded sheet of paper across the smooth, reflective mahogany surface of the table until it came to rest directly in the exact center, perfectly framed by the harsh overhead lighting specifically for the press pool's frantic telephoto lenses. Then I must admit that I find your stated, unwavering public commitment to be profoundly fascinating, Representative, Rubio stated, the last remaining vestiges of polite, senatorial warmth completely draining from his vocal cords until absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical, and deeply lethal edge remained, because the specific document that I have just placed before you on this table is not a manufactured partisan talking point, nor is it an opinion piece. It is a fully decrypted, legally verified copy of an internal, time-stamped email originating directly from the secured servers of your own chief of staff, sent to your closest legislative whips at exactly 11:42 p.m. on the exact night immediately preceding the final, critical roll call vote on that very same small business relief package. The massive room instantaneously went dead, terrifyingly silent, descending into the kind of absolute, breathless, and hyper-focused quiet where the frantic mechanical whirring of the camera lenses rapidly zooming in on the exposed document sounded exactly like a barrage of small-caliber gunfire as Rubio began to read the printed text aloud with the devastating, deeply detached, and entirely emotionless cadence of a homicide detective formally entering a bloody murder weapon into the permanent court record. This internal communication contains a very explicit, highly detailed, three-part legislative directive, strictly ordering your progressive coalition on how to act on the floor the following morning," Rubio read, his eyes methodically flicking from the damning words on the paper to her rapidly paling, suddenly rigid face. Directive 1. Mandate a unified block of abstention votes to deliberately freeze, stall, and ultimately kill the $50 million emergency relief package that was specifically earmarked to prevent struggling local small businesses from immediate insolvency. The stated, internal justification, authored by your own senior communications team. The legislation, while admittedly deeply helpful to the desperate public, did not simultaneously allocate any additional, unchecked funding into your specific committee's political media and progressive communications apparatus. Rubio deliberately paused his reading, allowing the grotesque, deeply cynical nature of the hidden rationale to hang suspended over the shocked room, letting the sheer weight of the betrayal sink into the minds of the listening press corps before delivering the final, catastrophic, and completely inescapable blow, his index finger tapping the center of the paper with a slow, rhythmic, and echoing thud. And finally, we arrive at the core political strategy of your office, which I will now quote verbatim from the text. Let the relief bill fail entirely on the floor. We will then immediately weaponize this legislative collapse, publicly blame the gridlock on the conservative opposition, and ruthlessly use the ensuing, inevitable economic devastation of these local mom-and-pop businesses as a high-yield, deeply emotional media narrative to solicit a massive, unprecedented wave of grassroots financial donations for our own upcoming election cycle. Down in the poorly lit, heavily shadowed corner of the general admission hall, the physically exhausted baker from Little Havana felt his breath suddenly, violently catch in his throat, his deeply calloused hands gripping the fabric of his jeans so tightly that his knuckles immediately turned a bruised, sickly white as the horrifying, soul-crushing reality washed over his tired mind that the agonizing, slow-motion death of his life's work, the bitter tears of the 3 dedicated employees he had been forced to fire just hours ago, had never been the result of an unavoidable economic tragedy, but had instead been nothing more than a carefully engineered, deeply malicious fundraising tactic actively orchestrated by the very same political campaign that loudly claimed to be his ultimate savior. Rubio leaned slightly forward over the table, bridging the physical gap between them, and delivered his devastating conclusion with a quiet, terrifying, and completely controlled fury. You sat there in the comfort of your congressional office and deliberately, knowingly suffocated the absolute last breathing chance for thousands of desperate family bakeries, local carpentry shops, and neighborhood restaurants, entirely severing their final lifeline solely and exclusively because your team cynically realized that their manufactured misery and impending bankruptcies would make a far more profitable marketing campaign than their actual salvation. Sensing with terrifying clarity that the political ground was violently, rapidly opening up beneath her feet to swallow her whole, and realizing in a state of absolute, adrenaline-fueled panic that her meticulously crafted, fiercely guarded public persona as the incorruptible champion of the working class was currently bleeding out on live, unedited national television, Ocasio-Cortez instantly retreated to the absolute core of her deeply ingrained political survival instincts, desperately attempting to violently rip the context of the conversation, completely away from the devastating, undeniable reality of the printed evidence sitting in front of her. She violently yanked the heavy base of the microphone so hard toward her chest that the metal bottom scraped harshly against the polished mahogany, producing a loud, ugly screech, her voice physically trembling with a frantic, over-engineered, and highly defensive indignation as she sought to immediately, aggressively reframe the clinical execution as an act of systemic, targeted oppression. Everyone in this room with eyes to see knows exactly what kind of despicable, highly coordinated, and deeply racist conservative smear campaign is happening here right now. She practically shouted, her eyes wide, flashing, and desperate as she deliberately looked entirely past Rubio and stared directly into the primary red lenses of the broadcast cameras, frantically fighting a losing battle to reclaim control of the spiraling narrative. You are deliberately, maliciously weaponizing an illegally acquired, highly doctored, and entirely out-of-context piece of opposition research to publicly ambush and attempt to completely destroy a working-class woman of color who actually has the rare courage to sit at this table and expose the deeply corrupt rotten foundation of your entire corporate establishment. It was, by all accounts, her signature, fail-safe rhetorical maneuver, a highly effective political ripcord she had successfully pulled 100 times before to immediately shut down hostile inquiries, a forceful, uncompromising injection of intense identity politics, explicitly designed to terrify her opponents into immediate, apologetic submission for fear of accidentally crossing an invisible, career-ending cultural tripwire. But before the loud echo of her severe accusation could fully materialize in the air, before the frantic press pool could even begin to type up the context of her desperate defense, the final, fatal interruption came not from the conservative Marco Rubio, but from the seat immediately to her left, utterly and permanently shattering the partisan, ideological shield she had just so desperately attempted to erect. The Honorable Mayor of Miami, a deeply respected, highly influential, and fiercely loyal silver-haired matriarch of the National Democratic Party, whose unimpeachable progressive credentials spanned 3 decades of grueling, effective city governance, slowly reached over with a trembling hand and pressed the red activation button on her own microphone, shaking her head with an expression of profound, weary, and completely unfiltered disgust. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," the veteran mayor said, her voice incredibly heavy with the grim, undeniable authority of a frontline leader who had spent the last agonizing month watching her beloved city's fundamental economic foundation violently crack and crumble. "I have personally walked the boarded-up, bankrupt avenues of this city. I have physically held the weeping hands of the desperate minority business owners who lost absolutely everything they had built when that specific relief bill mysteriously stalled. And I can assure everyone in this room, because I have already seen the verified, independent security logs of that exact congressional server, that email is entirely 100% authentic." The mayor slowly turned her heavy leather executive chair slightly to the right, flatly refusing to break her deeply disappointed, piercing eye contact with the younger, suddenly paralyzed congresswoman, delivering a brutal, bipartisan rebuke so fundamentally devastating, so completely unexpected, that it instantly sucked every last remaining molecule of oxygen out of the massive convention hall. "Do not dare insult the fundamental intelligence of the people in this room, and do not you ever attempt to cynically use the beautiful color of your skin or your gender as a convenient, bulletproof political shield to hide behind when you are caught red-handed committing a ruthless, highly calculated, and deeply unforgivable act of political betrayal against the very working-class citizens you loudly claim to love." The atmosphere in the Grand Convention Hall had thickened into an almost unbreathable, suffocating miasma of sheer, unadulterated shock, as a profound and absolutely terrifying physical and psychological paralysis instantly gripped the center stage, locking the undeniable, catastrophic reality of this unprecedented historical moment permanently into place beneath the blinding, unforgiving glare of the high-definition studio lights. For years, the supposedly impenetrable, defensive aura of righteous, untouchable infallibility had completely protected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, propelling her through a meteoric, gravity-defying national career that seemed absolutely immune to the traditional laws of political consequence. Yet in a span of mere agonizing seconds, that meticulously crafted, media-reinforced armor had just been publicly, irreparably, and brutally shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces, destroyed not by the expected, easily dismissible attacks of a hostile partisan rival seeking cheap, ephemeral sound bites, but by the cold, unforgiving, and completely objective weight of her very own documented, undeniable hypocrisy, which had just been firmly, methodically, and permanently confirmed on live television by an elder, highly respected stateswoman of her very own political party, whose somber, devastatingly calm delivery left zero room for misinterpretation. Stripped entirely of her vast, usually reliable arsenal of quick-witted rhetorical weaponry, she was left utterly and completely exposed before a deeply shocked, dead-silent national audience of tens of millions, with absolutely no pre-written talking points left on her transparent teleprompter to seamlessly deploy, no fiercely loyal partisan allies left on the stage willing to throw themselves into the brutal line of fire to hopelessly shield her, and no logical, face-saving avenues of escape remaining in a prime-time debate that had suddenly and violently transformed into a televised political execution. As the deafening, suffocating silence stretched on, her body seemed to physically and violently rebel against the catastrophic, real-time failure of her mind to formulate even a single coherent sentence of defensive response, her internal biological systems rapidly short-circuiting under the crushing, unimaginable gravity of the absolute public exposure. In a deeply desperate, almost entirely unconscious physical bid to quickly break the suffocating, microscopic, and deeply humiliating scrutiny of the staring room and the millions of unseen, judging eyes glaring through the cold camera lenses, her right hand began to drift slowly, aimlessly across the polished expanse of the heavy mahogany table, reaching blindly toward the waiting, condensation-covered glass of ice water, desperately hoping that the incredibly simple, completely mundane physical act of taking a sip could somehow magically reset the devastating reality of the last 5 catastrophic minutes, or at least miraculously buy her overwhelmed brain the crucial seconds it needed to reboot and find a way out of the trap. But halfway through the agonizingly slow motion, right as the robotic studio camera zoomed in with ruthless precision to capture the deeply vulnerable moment, her hand inexplicably and violently froze, suspended in midair, her trembling, pale fingers hovering mere inches from the cold, sweating glass, as a sudden, massive, and entirely uncontrollable nervous tremor rapidly traveled all the way up her forearm to her shoulder, a visceral, undeniable physical manifestation of a complete psychological and systemic collapse. It was exactly as if her central nervous system, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, unmitigated magnitude of the public exposure and the terrifying realization of her vanishing career, had suddenly and completely forgotten the fundamental, elementary biological mechanics of how to grasp a physical object, the paralyzing psychological shock of the brutal revelation forcefully severing the basic, instinctual neural connection between her mental intent and her physical capability. Slowly, agonizingly, and with every single high-definition, ultra, 4K camera in the cavernous room meticulously tracking the devastating, undeniable micro-expressions of absolute, irredeemable defeat, rapidly washing over her face, she was forced to painfully withdraw her violently trembling hand, deeply realizing with a sickening, terrifying drop in her stomach that attempting to pick up the heavy, slippery glass would inevitably result in a humiliating, uncontrollable spill that would physically broadcast her internal collapse to the millions of viewers watching from their living rooms, turning a profound political defeat into a viral, inescapable slapstick disaster that would loop on the internet for eternity. Instead, hopelessly cornered by undeniable reality and entirely out of options, in a final, hollow, and deeply tragic gesture of complete, utter, and unconditional political capitulation, she brought her shaking hand down heavily onto the rigid, protective cover of the sleek digital tablet resting on the table directly in front of her, pushing it firmly closed with a sharp, forceful, and terribly final snap that signaled the definitive, tragic end of her once unstoppable defense. The sound, a dry, incredibly violent, and completely isolated clack of hard plastic and tempered glass violently colliding echoed forcefully through the hypersensitive, directional tabletop microphones, ringing out like a solitary, devastating gunshot in a completely empty, abandoned stone cathedral, serving as the stark, defining, and unforgettable acoustic signature of an incredibly powerful, seemingly unstoppable political narrative abruptly, violently, and permanently terminating on live, primetime television. Meanwhile, far removed from the blinding, oppressive heat of the stage lights and the immediate, terrifying ruin of high-profile political careers, down in the thick, unlit, anonymous shadows of the cheap general admission seating area, the exhausted master baker from Little Havana finally let out a long, shuddering, and deeply heavy breath that he didn't even realize he had been tightly holding in his aching chest for the past agonizing hour. A quiet, melancholic, yet undeniably beautiful and deeply profound smile of absolute, pure vindication slowly began to spread across his heavily lined, deeply weary face, his dark, tear-filled eyes reflecting the distant, glaring stage lights as he finally, for the very first time in his extraordinarily arduous, heartbreaking life, a life recently and brutally defined by the agonizing, debt-ridden loss of his beloved, multi-generational family business due to the very detached, elitist policies championed by the woman currently freezing on stage, witnessed the arrogant, untouchable machinery of the Washington elite forced to violently choke on the bitter, inescapable ashes of their own unchecked, devastating hubris. Without bothering to wait for the visibly stunned, profusely sweating, and awkwardly stuttering debate moderator to clumsily attempt to facilitate an impossible, tone-deaf transition to the next scheduled debate topic, and with absolutely zero lingering desire to stay and endure whatever desperate, pathetic, and meticulously focus-grouped political spin her frantic, highly paid crisis communications team would inevitably attempt to violently deploy in the chaotic post-debate spin room, the humble, vindicated Baker quietly and respectfully stood up from his uncomfortable metal folding chair. He turned his broad, aching back entirely to the blinding, artificial stage lights that illuminated the wreckage of a political empire, and walked slowly, deliberately, with his chin held incredibly high and his stolen dignity finally and fully restored, toward the heavy, brass-handled exit doors, stepping confidently out into the suffocating, familiar, and strangely welcoming humid Miami heat to finally face the painful reality of the absolute ruin of his beloved business, leaving behind a completely frozen, thoroughly traumatized, and entirely silent convention hall in his solemn, dignified wake. Back inside the cavernous arena, the banks of massive national broadcast cameras remained unblinkingly, ruthlessly, and magnetically locked onto the devastating stage, flawlessly capturing the agonizing, static tableau of a completely paralyzed, utterly destroyed Congresswoman staring blankly and defeatedly at her tightly folded hands, accompanied by a grimly, silent, deeply disappointed Democratic mayor looking away into the darkness in obvious disgust and desperate political self-preservation, and an entirely unmoving, perfectly calm, and coldly calculating Marco Rubio, who was quietly, methodically closing the heavy golden clasps of his weathered leather briefcase with an air of absolute, terrifying finality. Above the stage, completely unseen by the live audience but frantically directing the flow of global history, the panicked, heavily sweating network producers screamed desperately into the crackling earpieces of the terrified control room technicians, their voices cracking with unprecedented, soaring adrenaline, watching the glaring red countdown timer and knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that in exactly less than 60 agonizing seconds, the live satellite feed would automatically and ruthlessly cut to a scheduled, jarringly cheerful commercial break for laundry detergent and car insurance. This relentless, ticking countdown officially left the entire, massive American political establishment staring blindly and helplessly into a terrifying, unprecedented, and completely unknown abyss, completely and utterly paralyzed by the horrifying, world-altering realization of exactly what the fast-approaching dawn and the inevitable, catastrophic, and completely uncensored public release of the fully unredacted, deeply incriminating, and heavily classified email server logs that Rubio's heavy leather briefcase had silently promised to the world was about to mercilessly, unstoppably, and irreversibly unleash upon the terrified, unprepared, and forever changed capital city, setting the absolute perfect stage for an explosive, apocalyptic fallout that would completely rewrite the fundamental rules of global power, leaving deeply hooked audiences everywhere desperately holding their breath, feverishly smashing the subscribe button, and absolutely dying to discover who would miraculously survive the coming storm in the next heart-stopping and thrillingly unpredictable chapter of this unprecedented political meltdown.